A few months back, I took a look at some of the best and the worst PS2 ports made for the console, and it kinda sent me down this wormhole of looking at ports for various other consoles as well. And although nowadays the differences across platforms is minimal at best, unless of course you're looking at games on the Nintendo Switch, I think people often forget that back in the day, the console of choice could often greatly affect the experience you were gonna get. So I thought it might be worth going back to the past to play the shitty games that suck ass, and take a look at some of the absolute worst ways to play the best games. Notice I said some of the worst, because this ain't supposed to be any kind of definitive list. It's just a compilation of some of the more infamous ones and those that I spent the most time playing. You got that? Having said all of that, let's get into it. Right, so let's kick the whole thing off with one of my all-time favorites, and that's a port for Doom on the Sega Saturn, released in 1997. And as anyone with a working internet connection probably knows, Doom has been ported to pretty much every single platform or device ever made.
That's true.
Now back in the late 90s, the Saturn was a pretty damn good console when it came to arcade ports. Being able to play things like House of the Dead, Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, not to mention Daytona Goddamn USA in your living room.
Gentlemen, start your engine.
So all of that, along with a port for one of the most popular PC titles of the 90s, really should have been a sure thing. Not to mention help to increase the dwindling popularity for Sega's underappreciated console. Only thing is, people then actually got to play it.
No.
And while it does seem widely accepted that Doom on the 32X and the 3DO are by far the worst ways to play this, what you don't hear people talking about quite as much is this Saturn port, developed by Rage Software, which definitely ain't too far behind. Now the first and most obvious thing with this version is just how it all looks, having a low resolution and frame rate, with slowdown often getting to the point that it just kind of feels like the game's running in the single digits. This version is based off the one released for the PlayStation, and again, not only comes with the entirety of Doom 1, but also Doom 2. Along with that incredibly specific password system that can track a whole lot of variables to more or less save your progress. But it really is just like a worse off version, with a lot of other effects and features just lacking completely, like all of the cool looking coloured lighting that they added in. And although it includes those new enemy variants like the Nightmare Spectres, there's no visual difference between the Nightmare and the normal ones anymore. Speaking of that too, like this might be the worst looking Spectre out of any Doom port that I've ever played, with it just looking like a highly dithered pinky demon that's slightly opaque. Weirdly too, like a lot of the weapons seem to fire faster on the Saturn, like the fire rate for the pistol and the shotgun. And then on the other foot, monsters seem to move slower. But by far the biggest problem this one has though is the price that it costs to actually get a physical copy. And while a lot of Saturn games might be pretty expensive, I think most of the time that's kind of justified, given how solid some of those titles genuinely are. Here though, it's like you expected to pay around $100 for one of the worst possible ways to play Doom. It's like, yeah man, for only $100, you too can play a bad version of a great game. I mean, yeah, what a deal. I do consider the Saturn to be a bit of an underappreciated console though, that really had some hidden gems. As for this version of Doom though, well, this ain't one of them. Though I guess on a positive note, this version didn't cause my console to hard crash like it did on the PS1. It's kind of crazy to think how Valve Software just dropped two of the all-time best shooters of all time with Half-Life 1 and 2, and then just never felt like they needed to do that much more with the series. Outside of a few expansion packs, some console ports, and that whole spin-off adventure with Half-Life Alyx. Now when it comes to the console ports, on the one hand you've got Half-Life on the PS2 released in 2001, which was not only a really solid port of that original game, but it also added in what's arguably one of the series' best side campaigns, with that exclusive co-op experience you got in Decay. But then on the other hand, we also got Half-Life 2 for the Xbox, which instead is really just a worse off way to play the same game, without anything really worthwhile added in to circumvent all of its shortcomings.
So wake up, Mr. Freeman. Wake up and smell the ashes.
Now, I've seen people absolutely rave about how amazing this port is for a whole bunch of reasons. And look, man, like, I don't deny that it's impressive from a technical standpoint, you know, that they even managed to get it working in the first place. I mean, given the technical prowess of that original Xbox, if it was going to be any console at the time, well, it was going to be this one.
Ah, yes. Gordon Freeman.
But that doesn't really change the fact that you're still playing a shitty version of what's easily one of the best first-person shooters ever made. As a comparison, like, did you ever play Doom 3 on the Xbox? Well, it was more or less the same kind of deal. They took an absolute juggernaut of a game like Doom 3 and then made the necessary optimizations to get it running on a home console. Even going so far as to trim levels down and even remove entire sections to accommodate the lesser hardware.
Good job, and good luck, Marine.
So not only did this allow the game to run on weaker tech, but it also made it kind of interesting, letting the player experience that original story from a bit of an alternate perspective, but still offering up that same journey overall for newcomers. Half-Life 2 on the Xbox, though, is just Half-Life 2. Only imagine now if the whole thing was running at 480p, a single-digit frame rate, and with the texture resolution set to be as low as humanly possible. I mean, I think about the only major change they made here is that during that area in the shantytown during Root Canal, they replaced a chain link fence with a concrete wall to fix performance. Goody gumdrops. And I kind of feel like when I see people raving about this version, I feel like this version just reminds them more of the good times that came with that era of gaming. You know what I mean? More so than what they're actually remembering the game was like specifically. Because I defy anyone to play through Water Hazard or Highway 17 and try to convince themselves that this is somehow a good version of the game. Is it like the worst possible thing ever to play this over the PC? Well, you know what, to be honest, not really. And in fact, I actually know a couple of people who experienced Half-Life 2 for the first time on the Xbox instead of the PC. But outside of all that circle jerking going on in regards to how they got this working to begin with, I just can't see the point here in advocating an objectively worse way to play something. Still though, it still plays a damn sight better than Half-Life on the Dreamcast. Now, if I ever go back and do like a top 10 games of all time list, without a doubt, Max Payne 1 and probably Max Payne 2 would be finding their way onto that list. Older fans of the series are probably going to remember that it had a completely unique version made for the Game Boy Advance, along with, of course, more faithful adaptations for the Xbox and the PS2. The latter of which, I'm sad to say, I spent a fair bit of time with as a teenager, along with trying to download videos of Tara Patrick on a 56k dial-up connection.
Sure. Yeah, really.
Anyway, I still remember when we got this one sent to us in the mail. It was like a reward or something for subscribing to Australia's official PlayStation 2 magazine at the time. And I think it's probably one of the first times where I played something on a PC first, before then playing it on a console afterwards. Really making me realize just how big of a gap there was between each platform. Because yeah, like again, in case it's not glaringly obvious, this version kinda sucked. First thing you notice about this PS2 port is when it comes to those graphic novel scenes, where entire pages now load in at once, instead of the panels popping up one by one, which, you know, kinda spoils where some of these scenes are heading right from the get-go.
You can't just come in here waving your piece like it meant something.
Along with the font also being completely different.
Guess I wasn't that smart.
Aside from that though, it's still the exact same game as its PC counterpart, only looking substantially worse and running just as poorly. As was pretty commonplace for a lot of console ports back then, levels had to be broken down into multiple areas. So the whole subway and bank heist opening level, for instance, is split up between 4 or 5 loading screens, as opposed to it just being one mostly seamless experience on the PC. And right away, like, this kind of thing just totally kills the pacing. Every time you're faced with another tedious loading screen, every 60 or so seconds.
What the hell was that?
And the best example of how this affects things is during that one level where you're confronting Rico Muerte in the bar.
Oh, Rico, you're so bad.
Now on the PC, the dude runs down a nearby hallway with his pants around his ankles, but on the PS2, because that hallway hasn't been loaded in, the guy just stands there in this nearby room right next to the bar. The one good thing there, I guess, is that these loading screens do more or less kind of serve as checkpoints, meaning you're never really losing all that much time whenever you're killed. And also too, it is worth saying that this version of the game has an absolutely insane auto-aim mechanic, where you pretty much just need to be facing in the general direction of an enemy and the bullets are going to sort themselves out. But still though, this is without a doubt the worst way to experience that first game. Which really is in stark contrast to how solid the Xbox version was. A version which is more or less the same as the PC, just with slightly downgraded visuals. Oh yeah, and if that's not enough for you, well, now consider that they also made a PS2 port for the sequel with Max Payne 2.
No.
Which, to the shock of absolutely no one, also runs and looks like complete shit.
It does look like shit.
It does at least get the graphic novels right this time though, keeping the proper font and loading them in panel by panel. But there's also just so many other bizarre issues and downgrades that this port has. Like this weird visual filter during some of the cutscenes, which just makes the image look even blurrier.
Did you do it? You killed her!
No, I can't.
The sound mixing during some of these is also completely missing or just out of sync, especially during those cool introductions for a new character, where it swoops in for a close-up and then slows right down. So it's really again just a worse looking and playing version of the original, even removing certain elements entirely. Like during that opening cinematic when Max is raiding the gun shop and meets up with Detective Winters, instead of there being two cops shooting at that escaping van, it's now only one. The facial animations, something which was a pretty cool engine advancement in the sequel, is completely absent here as well. So now during that scene when Max walks in on Mona taking a shower, the two of them just stare at each other like storefront mannequins.
Now that you're here, you can watch my back while I get dressed.
Removing all the subtle expressions they gave each other in the PC version. Oh yeah, and some of those textures are now such a low resolution that they're pretty much impossible to read. And while it is kind of nice that this one has a widescreen option, all this seems to do is just make things worse, killing that frame rate even more. On a positive note though, the levels aren't chopped up quite as much here as they were in the first game. And to be fair, like compared to other PS2 titles, this actually does look pretty damn good. I do like the fact as well that you can manually quick save at any time, which is a really handy and much needed feature. And despite all the problems these two versions do have, like, this is still Max fucking Payne we're talking about here. Yeah, Payne to the max. And you know what? Like, I'd still take Max Payne at his worst any day of the goddamn week. In fact, you know, maybe even in some way when playing this, you could kind of roleplay a little bit and pretend that the shoddy performance and the bad image quality is exactly the same as the way that Max sees the world. You know, after popping so many pills and living off his liquid diet of Jack Daniels.
Get it?
Yeah, I get it.
Now up next is another one of my all-time favorites, and that's Metal Gear Solid 2 Substance. Released for the PS2 and the Xbox, with the Xbox port surprisingly being the weakest of the bunch.
A dud!
Right, so for people who don't know too much about this one, basically what happened is Konami released MGS2 in 2001, and then in 2002 and 2003 they released MGS2 Substance for the PlayStation 2, the Xbox, and the PC, which is kind of like an enhanced edition of that base game, with a bunch of new features and modes added in, like the returning VR missions from MGS1. The thing is though, MGS2's substance for the Xbox wasn't based off the PlayStation 2. It's instead based off the version released for the PC and vice versa. And you'd really think that the Xbox would have blown that PS2 out of the proverbial water. Only that's not quite what happened.
Of course not. What a thing to say.
Now the one benefit that we do get here is that the Xbox supports 480p output, as opposed to the blurrier 480i that we got on the PS2. However, that difference isn't as massive as you'd expect here, considering that MGS2 was already like a pretty damn good looking game for the console to begin with. In fact, I reckon you'd be hard pressed to even see any major differences in regards to how clear that image is. And what is kind of funny as well is that despite this improvement, it actually also came with some other pretty big drawbacks, most notably being some of that hefty slowdown, which is most obvious during the opening tanker section, where it almost starts to feel like you're playing the game in slow motion. And then again later on, it gets pretty bad during the showdown with Fortune, where it kind of feels like the game's activated bullet time without telling you. I will be honest though, I do think the whole slowdown thing is blown a little bit out of proportion, but the thing is that it's there at all to begin with, which already makes it worse off than the PS2. Then there's also other minor visual differences, with the Xbox version having this slight color bleeding, and the water having this weird dithering effect that's not seen on the PS2 either. But the main issue by far is that Xbox controller, man, which lacks those 4 shoulder buttons that we got on the DualShock. And I kind of feel like the controls for Sons of Liberty on the PS2 were more or less perfect. I mean, they were prompt and precise, but more than that, like it felt that every button was mapped exactly where it needed to be, with there never being any confusion or fumbling around under pressure. First person aiming with R1 and then firing with the square button also made a lot of sense. I mean, if you stop to think about it, your hand is more or less in the exact same position it would have been if you were holding a gun in real life.
You asked for it.
And then removing your hand off R1 pulled you out of first person view, along with the sensitivity for the square button essentially being the same as removing your finger from an actual trigger. On the Xbox though, first person mode is bound to pressing down the left thumbstick, which then locks you into that mode until you press it a second time, which not only isn't as fast, but it becomes a bit of an issue during certain boss fights.
Are you going to shoot me?
Where you really have to fire at someone quickly before then moving again to avoid getting hit. So what it's really just doing is adding in an extra input. And the simple explanation for why this has happened is because the Xbox gamepad lacks its own version of L2 and R2.
I wasn't informed of that.
Another thing is that on the PS2, holding down L1 would let you run around while aiming your weapon. And as far as I can tell, you can't even do this on the Xbox at all.
Not a chance.
Now look, I will admit that for people playing this for the first time, none of this stuff is probably even going to matter. And even as a returning player, you can eventually get the hang of it.
If you're going to shoot.
But still, like, minor as it is an objective downgrade over just how perfect the controls were on the PS2. What isn't minor though, is how this version of Substance lacks that side mode where you could shred it up with Snake and Raiden, skateboarding around the big shell and grinding some fully sick rails in that incredibly bizarre side mode. To be fair though, that side mode is kind of crappy anyway, but again man, like it's more the fact that it's missing, you know, as opposed to the actual quality of that mode itself. And as they say, like one man's trash is another man's treasure. The long and short of it is that back in those days, Metal Gear Solid really was a Sony-focused series. And from MGS1 up until at least MGS4, they were clearly designed with Sony peripherals and platforms in mind. Like in MGS1, where you've got Mantis making jokes about reading your memory cards, or in MGS4, where Otacon remarks about the Blu-ray disc capabilities of the PS4.
Huh? Oh, wait! We're on PlayStation 3! It's a Blu-ray disc.
Whoa, slow down, egghead.
The series has since been ported and remastered to countless other platforms, with the HD collections and the Master Collection, but playing MGS2 on the Xbox back then, it just didn't feel like the way it was intended, because it wasn't. I wouldn't say that this is the absolute worstest thing in the world to play through, and at the end of the day, like, you're still getting all that good stuff that comes with it. Yeah, all that crazy, wacky Pete Kojima era stuff.
Not too shabby, is it?
However, I would say that this version is now all but completely redundant, which it is.
A dud!
Right, so now we're heading back again to the era of 90s shooters and the Sega Saturn with the console port for Quake. And it brings me no joy to say that sadly this is another swing and a miss for a Sega Saturn port. Now this version was worked on by none other than Lobotomy Software. Yeah, the same guys who made the awesome Power Slave. And if you're looking at this one thinking it looks more like their games than it does its softwares, well, the reason for that is because this version of Quake is running on their engine. Yeah, the same one they use for Power Slave and the Duke Nukem 3D port. With the biggest difference there now being the more simplistic enemy models, along with the fact that all of the weapons are now 2D sprites instead of being fully 3D. Enemy corpses will also eventually disappear after a while as well, probably due to like memory limitation or something, so you don't really need 20/20 vision to see that this whole thing is a massive step down from the PC. Not only does it look like shit, but it also runs like cold shit, with a piss weak frame rate that makes accuracy a lot tougher than it should be.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
There's lots of minor changes there to the way that enemies behave. Like ogres and knights, for instance, seem to move much slower now. And in the case of the ogres, like these guys seem to be a lot more reluctant to even use their grenade launchers. There's no hard difficulty mode anymore either, just easy, normal, and then nightmare. But not being able to manually save throughout the level is still the biggest blunder here. Because as I'm sure anyone who's played Quake can tell you, death in this game can often be pretty damn sudden, and limitations like the lack of a manual save aren't really helping.
Fucking A. Oh, hold on.
I mean, damn dog, like it's hard enough beating levels on the PC without dying, let alone here on the Sega Saturn where things are running at like 10 frames a fucking second. It's not all bad though, and at least visually, like there are some neat things here and there that I do appreciate. I mean, I like it how all the slip gates have this eerie red glow around them, really capturing the foreboding and mysterious nature to where these things would transport you. And some of the subtle effects they've added into certain levels does look nice. Plus it also does have that original 9 Inch Nail soundtrack working from the get-go, which is always a bonus. But this is really like the Buffalo Bill of Quake games, and by that I mean it's a completely different beast wearing someone else's clothes.
It puts the lotion on.
I can overlook a lot of issues in other console ports, like Quake on the 64 for instance, because whilst that one also might have a bit of a dodgy frame rate, at least there, like it still felt like a Quake game.
Fucking A. Oh, hold on.
Not something running in a stitched together ghetto version of the goddamn build engine. And then the final 9-inch nail in the coffin for this one is again the cost you're looking at if you want to actually get a physical copy. I mean, yikes. I feel like Resident Evil is one of those franchises where it's always relevant to a discussion, because it seems every year there's like a new game coming out, a terrible new film or TV series, or a new port or remaster.
Great.
In fact, only just a few weeks ago, they released the first game for PC on goodoldgames.com. But that's not what we're talking about. The one we're going to be focusing on next is the original Resident Evil 4, released way back in 2005.
Resident Evil 4.
This is great!
Originally for the Nintendo GameCube and then for the PlayStation 2 later that same year. And this was actually the way that I first played Resident Evil 4 back in the day. Simply because at the time we didn't own a GameCube, and I was still convinced that the PS2 was the greatest console ever made. It wasn't until a few years later when I'd finally seen it in action on a GameCube when I realised just how wrong I was. Now again, content-wise, this is still the same game that everyone else got to experience. In fact, it's actually more than what we got on the GameCube, with the inclusion of that at the time exclusive Ada Wong campaign Separate Ways. But where the main campaign is concerned, it's easily one of the worst ways to experience Capcom's 2005 classic. On a positive note, I guess, this PS2 port does support progressive scan mode at 480p, just like the GameCube did, but looking at each version side by side, it's still plain to see that the PS2 looks blurrier and worse off in almost every regard.
No thanks, bro.
This becomes a bit of an issue with aiming certain weapons, seeing as 99% of the guns all use laser sights, which can kind of make it really tough to see when you're shooting at something off in the distance. But more than that though, it's also just how it feels when you're playing, which is something that I can't really convey with visuals alone. It is actually kind of staggering though, just how smoothly that GameCube version still stacks up. I was even playing through it last week to get a bunch of updated footage, and it is still really fun to play.
Thank you.
So going from that version right across to the PS2 right after, it made it even more noticeable in just how much worse off it is. You've got the minor things like the loading times being longer, through to much more noticeable differences. Like how the PS2 always feels like there's some kind of input delay when pressing buttons. Not to mention, I'm also convinced that the RNG mechanics are messed up here as well, because the difference in stocked up ammo and items I had on the GameCube compared to the PS2 was pretty much night and day. At the end of the day though, Ubisoft's infamous 2007 PC port is still the worst way to play RE4, but when you realise that the PC port was based off this PS2 version, then it all starts to make sense. And the only objective benefit this version has, or did have, was that at the time exclusive Ada Wong campaign. But even then, this thing was kinda mid.
There are some things in the world better off not knowing.
So this was that much shorter story mode where you played as Ada, alongside all the events in the main game that you experienced through Leon's perspective. But outside of seeing Ada running around in a leggy dress, there really wasn't much going for it. I mean, for starters, Ada gets the black tail pistol, which is easily one of the worst pistols in the entire game. And then her shotgun is also completely dreadful too. And then more than that, buying other weapons was incredibly expensive, and the ability to upgrade and improve them was completely removed. It was kind of cool to see that same story from Ada's perspective though, seeing Leon off in the distance and that kind of stuff, and outright affecting and helping his journey along the way. But this also means that it gave Capcom the excuse to just flat out recycle the same environments, bosses, and even some of the puzzles, swapping these around to give off the illusion that it's somehow new. I think the only real new mechanic is Ada's grappling gun, but you use this so little that it doesn't even really seem to matter. And then finally, the fact that they included this campaign in every single version of RE4 that followed kind of makes it even more pointless to play through it now on the PS2. I will say though that in the game's defense, despite all the problems, this is still motherfucking Resident Evil 4, bitch.
You're goddamn right.
And yes, that's hardly a bad thing. And either way, as a 19-year-old pothead in 2005, I still managed to spend countless hours playing through and beating this thing over and over, without knowing any better. So yeah, it's not like it's unplayable. They do say ignorance is bliss, which it might be, but you know what? So is shooting a bunch of infected Spanish villagers at point-blank range with a shotgun.
I think he's got a point.
And that brings me on to the final game on the list with the original Splinter Cell. Hands down one of the most important games ever made. Not only because it was a huge step forward for the stealth genre, but also because it was just a monumental achievement for that original Xbox, showing off some really advanced visuals and impressive dynamic lighting systems that hadn't really been achieved yet on the platform. The story puts you into the well-worn boots of seasoned veteran Sam Fisher, working for the NSA and carrying out top-secret missions around the globe, as you set out to stop a biological weapon from being unleashed. And while it might have aged in some regards, it's still a really tight, well-told story, with a satisfying stealth system and some memorable missions. That PS2 port though is a little bit different. Now this was released in 2003, alongside a port for the GameCube and Microsoft Windows. Only, whereas the version on the PC is pretty much identical to the Xbox, the one for the PS2 and GameCube had to make a few modifications, with the PS2 being the most unique again in that regard, mostly where the downgrades are concerned. And what's without a doubt the biggest step down there is that you can't shoot out anywhere near as many lights anymore, which was a huge component to the original. I mean, being able to shoot lights out and keep yourself hidden was one of the key gameplay elements that series introduced. Useful as a distraction, but also just to keep yourself out of an enemy's line of sight. So replacing that with these indestructible light sources on the PS2 really kind of hinders that overall experience. There's also visual changes to certain missions, like the one set on the oil rig now takes place at night time instead of during the day. On the Xbox and PC, the mission inside the CIA headquarters had this whole sequence where you started outside in the rain, and then had to sneak through a ventilation fan and somehow get through a nearby security checkpoint. On the PS2 though, Sam just begins inside from the get-go, with a brand new cinematic showing him walking right on in with a security pass before then unbuttoning his shirt like he's Clark Kent turning into Superman. During the mission where you gotta sneak into the Kalina Tech building, there's this whole shootout now they've added in during the parking lot, where for some reason the lighting is now completely fried as well. Oh yeah, and speaking of lighting, like this is easily the worst looking version of that first game, with the heat mode in particular just looking kinda crappy, especially compared to the GameCube and the Xbox. But the main thing that brings my piss to a boil here is just how long it takes to save and load a game. And while this has always been a series based around trial and error, when it comes to the stealth at least, a lot of that frustration was alleviated on the Xbox and the PC, simply because whenever you screwed up, it took you literal seconds to restart. On the Xbox, loading a checkpoint was near instantaneous, and on the PC you had the added benefit of quick saving and quick loading. Here though on the PS2 it's a much slower and agonizing process, with the console taking a lot longer to get things going. I will say though that on a positive note, I do think it's kind of cool how they've included the contextual controls from the other games. So that means like when you approach a locked door for instance, there's a menu you can cycle through to use your optic cable or lockpick automatically. You don't have to manually select each item anymore. And if you've already discovered the code for a keypad, the game is going to display it on screen when you're inputting it, saving you having to back out and check your notes if you've somehow forgotten it.
Check your upset.
There is also of course that whole unique mission, exclusive to the PS2, set inside a nuclear power plant, which is actually pretty good. Though you could kind of argue that it does mess up the pacing of the campaign's overall narrative, sending you off on this hour-long detour.
That's what happens when you lie.
I am ashamed to say as well that again like RE4, this was the first way that I originally played through Splinter Cell. And back in the day, like I didn't really seem to have too many problems with it. But back then, I also thought it was a good idea to risk the family computer's entire livelihood on downloading risky pornography off LimeWire. My point is that back in 2003, I was clearly not the best judge of what's right or wrong. And I don't know man, like I just feel that with this one, when it seriously handicaps those aspects like the lighting and the environmental interactivity, you know, in a game focused heavily around lighting and environmental interactivity, well that's kind of a hard fault to overlook. Either way though, that brings me to the end of the video.
Good lord.
I'm sure there's probably like a whole heap of other shitty ports I forgot to talk about that would still be worth mentioning. So let me know in the comments below if you had any similar experiences throughout the years. And if there's any other titles you'd like to see me talk about, good or bad, well, let me know. And as always, thanks for watching.